Hey guys, so I wanted to have a quick look at the Sri Lankan presidential elections that are coming up and have a quick dive into the parties and the candidates they've put forward and actually look at this from the people's perspective and have a brief overview of the problems that people currently face in Sri Lankan society and see if any of these candidates are actually coming forward with a solution, and if so, what is the ideal. So first off, let's look at the parties. So in recent Sri Lankan politics, we've had two main parties in the running. Those parties being the SLFP and SLPP, they're kind of working together, and the UNP. So SLFP, Sri Lankan Freedom Party, SLPP, Sri Lankan Podujuna Peramana, UNP being the United National Party. So they've put their candidates forward. So you've got Gotabaya Rajapaksa and Sajid Premadasa running as candidates for those guys. So alongside these main parties, we have the alternatives. So the alternatives are headed up by a group called the JVP. So they're the front runners amongst the group of alternatives, and they have Anura Dissanayake as their front runner. So there's a dozen more groups or so, and you've got individuals running in the whole thing. Some of them I've listed here as well. So let's look at what the people have been talking and wanting and needing for. So in summary, a system change. That is what people are after. So let's take a look at what actually a system change means. So I've kind of bucketed it into two main areas. So good governance and a better life. In terms of governance, Sri Lanka has notoriously had corruption in systemic corruption in its governance. Within its MPs, taking backhands and essentially there for their own benefits. I'm not painting all MPs to be like this, but it's a systemic problem. And what we've found is that there's a lack of a rule of law, especially within the ruling elite. So one of the most prevalent ideas right now is to send the 225 home. And what I mean by that is currently in Sri Lankan politics, there are 225 members of parliament, and the notion says we do not need 225 people as MPs. We can reduce that significantly. And that's one of the main good governance stuff. And in terms of a better life, it's basic things that people are asking for in terms of healthcare, security, etc. So the next question we can ask ourselves is, is there a solution? Well, I've explored some of the sort of things that the candidates have put out, and the most interesting one that has been put forward is by a candidate called Nagananda Kodituwakku. So what has Nagananda really said? So this is very interesting because this is a world first. No one has ever done this before. But what Nagananda is saying is that a vote for Nagananda is not a vote for him to be president. A vote for Nagananda is for his autochthonous constitution. So this is basically a new way to bring about a significant change by essentially hijacking the presidential election and using that as a referendum to basically ask the people, do we want this autochthonous constitution? So let's try and understand what this all means, because it's very new and it's quite complicated. So let's actually consider what is a constitution to start with. So a constitution is basically the key principles that a state is governed by. So it's the fundamental things that a state must follow in all its laws. So in the current Sri Lankan constitution, there have been 19 amendments. It's quite a lot. And essentially one seems to come about every time there is an election. And in the most relevant ones to really look at is the 18th and the 19th Amendment. So let's take a look at those guys. So in the 18th Amendment, this was one of the most controversial amendments ever made in Sri Lankan history. And it has been described as making a mockery of democracy in Sri Lanka because it gave the president an unfair amount of power over the governance of the country. It allowed the president to remove the cap of 2 terms for the president, and it gave the president the power to essentially pick and choose the MPs in power without actually having to consult the Prime Minister or anything. And everyone has kind of seen how wrong this is, and they have repealed most of these in the 19th. So now the president has become a lot less powerless, and most of these powers now currently vest within the Prime Minister. So that is the post with the most amount of power in Sri Lankan politics today. So let's take a look at what how you actually bring about a constitutional change. So to get a constitutional change, you need 2/3 majority in the parliament. So the parliament currently has 225 people. So for this example, let's say we have 300 people in our parliament. We will need 200 of them to vote any amendment through and say, yes, we're happy with that amendment, for that amendment to go through and become part of the constitution. So currently, as I said, we have 225 people. So 2/3 of these guys will need to vote to approve any change. So that is how we make an amendment to a constitution. If we want to repeal the constitution, we also need a referendum. So a referendum is where essentially we ask the people and try and see if they want to change the constitution. And to do that, we need 50%, over 50% of the people to say, yes, that is what we want. And right now what Nagananda's doing is essentially bypassing this and asking the people, because he's actually allowed to do this, because in our constitution right now it states the Republic of Sri Lanka, in the Republic of Sri Lanka, sovereignty is in the people and it's inalienable. What that means is that it can't be taken away. It can't be removed from the people. So the people's power is the most, essentially the biggest power in governance of Sri Lanka. So people's power can overrule most of the things. There are bits in here which talks about the constitution and how you repeal the constitution and how there are other votes in place. I will take you guys through that on another day because I want to try and keep this quite short. But it is doable by this constitution as well. And anyways, let's go back to what Nagananda says. So as I said, this autochthonous constitution is not just Nagananda writing out a constitution that he thinks is fit. He has actually gone out and it's a collaborative effort of hundreds, if not thousands of people who have reviewed and added and taken away clauses from this constitution. And right now, I believe it's in its final stages. So, like I said before, Nagananda is putting forward this novel idea of getting a constitution which essentially takes into account a lot of this governance issue. It ends corruption because there are some strong stances against corruption, and it actually appeals to a lot of these changes that we were trying to do. I will link the actual constitution in the description below. Take a look at it. It's actually a very it seems like a constitution that every country can actually relate to and actually abide by, and yeah, it's great. I give my full support to it. So, but how does that actually mean? Like, do we all just vote for this Nagananda guy because he's just got this constitution? Or what should we do? Because as I said before, historically we've had two main political parties and they have had the majority of the votes. And this guy, Nagananda Kodituwakku, has come in with this new idea and he's hijacking the presidential elections and using that as a referendum to get the people's power back. It sounds like an interesting idea. So let's see what the ideal would be. So what is the ideal? So if NK, Nagananda Kodituwakku, gets his message across to the people and he says that yes, you guys are voting to get the power back to the people because of change that if anyone wants to make a change in politics, they need a 2/3 majority. So if you're trying to drop 225 down to say 60, which is what Nagananda Kodituwakku's constitution says, you can't do that because it's just not going to happen. Because if you go to a parliament and you ask people, yes, we want to push this new constitution through, and it actually means that over 150 of you guys are going to lose your job, they're not going to vote for it. We can't make a significant change and rely on the parliamentarians to do that for us. That's why we need a people's referendum, and that is what Nagananda Kodituwakku is doing here. It is a hijack of the presidential election for a people's referendum for a new constitution. So, what is the ideal? Like I said, Nagananda Kodituwakku's constitution needs to happen. It must. But does it mean that we need to vote for Nagananda Kodituwakku? No, it doesn't. We do not need Nagananda Kodituwakku to be the person to win a presidential election. What needs to happen is a collaborative effort of all of the alternatives. So if we get all of our alternative groups, like I said, the JVP, Abhiman, NPM, all of our these smaller alternative groups to bind together and go as one unit and use Nagananda Kodituwakku's constitution and say, if we get over 50% of the votes, this constitution is approved, then we can go forward and actually change this system, and the people get the power to change the system. That is the ideal. So, and if we can even get other groups, if the thing is, I use the alternatives because those are the guys who really want to make the difference. And the other two main parties have been in power so long, and they know that they have too much to lose by putting in a constitution like this. So that's why I said the alternatives. But essentially, if we can bring in a new constitution and get the people to do it, that is the ideal. And that is what I think the Sri Lankan community needs to understand. This guy here is actually providing us a solution. Let's try and listen to him and see what he has to say.